he says in verse 11, he says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. What the writer is saying here is, you used to think it was all about you. You thought as a child.
That's our children. That's right.
You thought when you were blessing someone, they owed you something in return. And he says, but as I grow in God, and as I get to know God more, I get to understand that that's not love to God.
Me at all. Come on now.
You don't even know who I am. But he says, but when I grew and I started to understand what a man, I really understood, and I started to grow in God, I started to know that when you really love somebody, they can't do nothing for you. And you still want to do good for them. When they can't pay you back. They have no means to do so. But when you give and bless anyway, that's God. And so oftentimes we are so twisted in this society that that's the way we do everything. We treat every relationship like that. Well, I'm going to bless my children so they act right. Well, I'm going to, we find things. Well, you know what? I'm going to go buy my wife something. I'm going to do something around the house. And then maybe she will give me something in return. Wow. And so we create all our relationships based on this quid pro quo. And understand that's not what love is to God.
No, Lord, no.
And the word of God, God's idea of love is, even if the person is laying there and they have no way to pay you back. They have no means to pay you back. I just want to bless you because I love you. And so he said on this thing, all the laws, everything that God is about, he says this is what it hangs on. You can't make nobody do this stuff. You can't do it for man's praise and glory. He says you have to do it because you have the heart of God. And the heart of God says, I just do it because I love you that much. And so even sometimes people get this thing twisted that, if I want God to bless me, I need to go do X, Y, and Z. But God don't work that way. And that's frustrating, I think, to some people, because what you find out as you get closer to God is you can't con him into doing anything he don't want to do.
No. Mm-mm.
You ain't going to be able to do nothing. You ain't going to be able to say, well, I'm going to get up and start praying and read my Bible more, and God going to bless me with this house I want. And you start playing this game with God. He don't work that way.
That's what they teach, though.
And so you get very frustrated with God because everything that you've built your understanding on is, if I do something for someone, they owe me something in return. And God doesn't operate that way. And he says when you're doing his work, you can't operate that way. And so he goes on in verse 11, he talks about, hey, he changed his understanding. And then he says in verse 12, he says, for now we see through a glass darkly, which means we don't understand what we're looking at. We don't understand God. We think we understand him and we looking at him, but it's dark. Understand it's darkness. What he really is saying there is you have evil intentions. And then he goes on and says, but then face to face, at some point when you get in those final hours, you're going to be face to face with God. And he says, now I know in part, but then shall I know even also as I am known. So God says in those final hours, you're going to be standing, we stand in the mirror, we looking at ourselves. And at the end of the day, we kind of don't, we know we selfish and we know we kind of prideful, but we looking at ourselves in the mirror and we say, well, I don't really see that. I'm going to choose not to see that. But he says in those final hours, God going to put the mirror in front of you. And you're going to have to look at yourself as to who you really are. And he says, but then I shall know even as I'm also am known. Who do people say you are? You're going to have to look at yourself in the mirror and you're going to have to know, were you really operating out of love or were you operating out of self? And so as you start closing in on those final hours, those final days, you can get an opportunity to do a self-inspection. And God says you're going to get to see yourself for who you really are. And what your intentions really were.
Yes.
And he says, not only are you going to see it, he says you're going to see how people really viewed you. He says, because, but then I shall know even as also I am known. And then he says, and now abideth faith, hope, and charity. At the end of the day, that's what you got. You got faith, you got hope, and you got charity. He says, but at the end of the day, if you say what's the greatest of them, Love. You say, well, why is love? He says, because that's what all the laws hang on.
You preaching today. You are.
That's what all the laws hang on. That's why it's the greatest one of them. He says, will I find faith? He did talk, that is important. But he says, all the laws that I put in place, I didn't want to make you follow my laws. He says, but if you have love for me, you will follow my laws, not because you have to, because you desire to.
He said that. If you love me,
you keep my commandments.
Come on now.
So that's why he says that the Greek word makareri, which means, and it's spelled M-A-K-A-R-I-O-I. It says that word means blessed. It means hopeful. It means to be satisfied. To be satisfied, and it refers to those things received from God. That's what that means. And so when you read oftentimes you read if you read the original translation, Greek translation, in the New Testament, oftentimes we read the word blessed. It's really the Greek word makareri, and so makareri means to be blessed, to be hopeful, and it means to be satisfied, and it refers to receiving things from God and God's favor, regardless. And this is the key thing: regardless of circumstance.
Regardless, come on now.
And so, understand, if I ask you, in our way, we say, well, when do we say somebody's been blessed? It usually has some kind of financial or some kind of personal benefit. So, you say, well, such and such blessed, they just got a new house. So, he blessed me with a new car. He blessed me with a job. And understand God's definition, that's really not blessed. In his biblical definition. But that's how we on this place called earth view what a blessing is. And so, but what you'll really start to understand is, and we're going to read a couple scriptures just so you get it. Go to Matthew 5. And let's listen to what Jesus says here in Matthew 5. Go to verse, we're going to read 3 through 11 really quickly. And he says this. Matthew 3, and this is Jesus speaking. Matthew 5, 3 through 11. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. And then in verse 12, we'll read, it says, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And persecuteth they the prophets which were before you. So understand, Jesus says to be blessed. It didn't say anything about any kind of prosperity. It didn't say anything about getting no jobs. It didn't say anything about getting no houses. Didn't say anything about getting no cars. Didn't say anything about getting accepted into the school you want. It don't say anything about it. That's not being blessed. But on this place called earth, that's what we tie blessing to. It has to be some selfish thing. It has to be about us. We talked about the word selfishness means a person, action, or motive lacking consideration for others, concerned chiefly with one's own personal profit or the motives of our own selves. But understand, all this stuff Jesus is talking about here, when he is defining blessed, this ain't selfish. This ain't got nothing to do with your money. It's got nothing to do with that.
Reward in heaven.
But he says your true reward is in God. And he says, and I love it that he wraps it up in verse 11. Understand, when you start thinking this way, you don't fit in with this place called earth. Because when you start understanding that your blessings come from God and not man, he says, blessed are ye when men shall revile you. They don't like you. Mm-hmm. And he says they want to persecute you in all manner of evil. and they're going to become false against you. But understand, he says, hey, you got to rejoice. And be exceedingly grateful because your reward is in heaven. It's not on this place called earth. Mm-hmm. And he says, you know you're right because the ones that came before you that was teaching my word, that understood my word, they were persecuted also. So he says, that's how you know you're in the right place. So understand, we'll go to Luke really quickly, 11:28. Let's see what he says about being blessed. Luke 11:28. He says this in 11:28. Luke chapter 11, verse 28, he says this. He says, but he said, yea, rather, blessed are they that hear the word of God and keep it. He said, you want to be blessed? Hear the word of God and keep it. Then he goes on, and we'll go to Romans really quick, and then we'll go to Revelations. Because he ends the book with talking about what being blessed is going to look like. Go to Romans 4 and 7 really quickly. Romans chapter 4, verse 7, he says this. Saying, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. When you say, well, my blessing, God, is that my sins have been forgiven and I'm covered. So, you know.
We missed the last, I'm sorry.
Luke 11:28.
Revelation.
Oh, we're going to get to Revelation. That was Romans 4:7.
Okay.
4:7 is what I'm reading now. It says, saying, blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven. Sins are forgiven. Iniquities are forgiven. Though the times that they've broken the law, it's been forgiven, and their sins are covered. He says those people are blessed. Then he goes on in the book of Revelations, and he's going to tell us about being blessed in Revelations. In chapter 14, verse 13, he says this. In 14:13, he says, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, write, blessed are the dead, which die in the Lord, from henceforth, ye saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. He said, I don't care about what you got on earth. I don't care about what praise. I don't care about who gave you awards or who called your name out or who made you famous. He says, that's not being blessed. He says, but if you know me, understand that you've done things with my heart, and as if I desired them, he says, that's when you're going to be blessed. Go to Revelations 19:19. And he says this. He says, and I saw the beast and the king of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse against the army. And you say, well, what's I don't understand 19:19. But understand what he says. He says, I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his armies. Understand this way of thinking, that your true reward comes from God. You're going to be an enemy on this place called earth. And understand, he says so much so, he say the beast, his kings of the earth, which he told us who it was, and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse. Understanding
Jesus, come on now.
Jesus, they're fighting against, it's a war here. Because they have started, he says, if you start thinking the way Jesus thought, you become public enemy number one. And so, anytime you start blessing and you start giving out of the way God gave, and you ain't looking for no glory. You ain't looking for nobody to write you up in no bulletin. You ain't looking to take no pictures and post it on social media.
Dick.
But you just doing it because God says there's a need there, and I am too. He says you're supposed to give to those in need. He told us in Matthew 5:13. He say, blessed are those who care for the poor. That's what you're supposed to do. That's because that's what Jesus did. That's what God wanted him to do. Not because he was trying to gain no popularity, not because he was trying to put on no show, but he says, if you see somebody in need, how can you not help? And you say you know God, because God is a God of love. So understand that we read the scriptures, there is no hint of material prosperity or perfect circumstance for any of the New Testament terms of blessing. And on the contrary, blessing is typically connected with those that are in poverty or those that in a trial or spiritual benefit. So it doesn't have some kind of materialistic tie to it. But understand he's helping those who are in poverty. He's helping those who are going through trials and being persecuted. He's helping you spiritually, giving you a spiritual benefit of being joined to him. In closing, we're going to go to the book of Psalms, but the world's use of the word blessing or being blessed, they use that word synonymous with success and prosperity or a good life. When reading the scriptures, what you'll find out is that it doesn't mean any of that at all. And neither does this whole concept of giving. When you say we're in the season of giving and you giving, if giving to you is showing that you got to go post on Facebook or look at what my organization done and let me show you all the toys we bought, let me show you the baskets and let me show you the families we've blessed, if that's your definition, understand God says if you want the praises of man, do that.
Your reward. Come on now.
And he says that will be your reward. But we read the scriptures, he says in his mind, that's an abomination.
Come on.
Especially if you say you're doing it in his name. Because he don't operate that way. He says you ought to want to do that. Not because you have to. Not because you're trying to put on no show. But he says if you know me and you know how the heart I have, I'm going to do that because I know there's a need there. In closing, let's go to Psalms. The book of Psalms, Psalms 1. And it says this in closing. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law. What's the law? The law is love. Blessed is his delight in the law of the Lord, and in his law doeth he meditate day and night.
Yes.
So you say, well, what's the law? Jesus told you what the law was. He say love is the law. He says love is what the whole thing hangs on. So he says you delight in the law. Well, you not delight in law. You delight in love. You delight in the love of God. And he says you meditate on it day and night. You say, why you got to meditate on it day and night? Because you live in a world, you live on a place called earth that is so counter to what God is about. He said you got to meditate on this thing day and night. And then he says, in verse 3 says, and he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaves also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff, which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of righteousness. For the Lord knoweth the way of righteousness, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. He told us in previous scriptures, in 1 Corinthians 13, he tells us at some point you got to look yourself in the mirror. And you can try to, at first you can try to act like, well, you don't see what is known. But he says at the end times, and he reminds us here, he says, for the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. All the stuff you've done, all that stuff you've done, every time you got your name recognized and you've been doing something and you say I'm helping people, but you say, well, look at what I'm doing. And every time you done posted something on social media showing everybody what you've done, that's going to all pass away. So that's going to all perish. Nothing. And the other thing he says is if you're truly doing it out of God's love, you don't get shaken when nobody says thank you. You don't get upset when nobody goes out of their way to bring some attention to you. But he says if you're doing it with earthly intentions, where you want praise, you want glory, and you want to do it selfishly because you're trying to bring attention to you and your organization and your church, understands, he say, you're going to be driven away. Because when people don't respond the way you want them to respond, you'll stop. But understand, God, that ain't love to God. Because even when we don't respond the way he wants us to respond or we should respond, he don't stop loving. He don't stop giving. He doesn't stop sowing. He doesn't stop. And he says on that's what love is to him. And he says when you go around doing your giving, your blessing, he says if you're doing it with his intentions, don't you be sitting around here waiting on nobody to say thank you. Don't you be sitting around thinking, oh, well, you know what? I'm going to get to these people and that's going to make my church grow. That's not God. God says what a need is, that's where I am. They may receive me, they may not. But we understand this, the Bible tells us. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. You say, well, what's the rain mean falling? You do understand everybody needs rain to live. Whether you're a believer or non-believer, if you want your vegetation to grow, your trees to grow, your grass to grow, your crops to grow, you need rain. And God say, I'm blessing the just and unjust.
Purification. Come on now.
He don't have to respect the person. So understand that even if you don't even believe in him, God said he'll bless you anyway. Because he loves you that much.
That's the type of God we serve. Come on.
And so he desires that we be the same way. If somebody can't do nothing for you, they don't ever say thank you. If God lays it on your heart and you see the need is there, do it. Because he says at the end of the day, he'll be your reward. He will give you the glory. He will give you the shout out in heaven.